Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to those who are with us in this building and for those who are watching us online. Today we have our third talk as part of the Inclusive Theology series, and it's on trauma theology. A bit of housekeeping first as usual. For those who are watching us online, if you would like to ask a question, you can do it via our email, inclusive.theology.series@gmail.com. We would also appreciate getting your feedback via email or in a conversation afterwards. After the session, refreshments will be available, so please stay if you would like to. We also have our pastoral team available, and especially for this topic that might be quite sensitive, so if you would like to talk to someone afterwards, then we have Imogen here, Christina, and myself. The event is free, but if you would like to donate, you can tap your card on your way out or leave some cash in the basket on the refreshment table, and you can also donate through our website. And now it's time to introduce our speaker. Today we have with us Dr. Karen O'Donnell, who is a feminist theologian with particular interest in the ways in which bodies interact with theologians. This has led her to research in feminist theologies and in trauma theologies as areas of specialism. Karen is the academic dean at Westcott House, where she teaches liturgy, trauma theology, sacramental theology, and pedagogy. She also teaches gender and Christian theology for the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge University. Karen is the author of several books, including Broken Bodies, The Eucharist, Mary and the Body in Trauma Theology, and The Dark Womb, Reconceiving Theology Through Reproductive Laws. Karen, the floor is yours.
Mary's considerably taller than I am, but thank you very much. Thank you for being here this evening. It's such a lovely evening. I don't know why you're here listening to me when you could be out sitting enjoying some well-deserved sunshine, but I'm very glad that you're here. I will also say that I am on the verge of a cold, and so if I start to croak, it's not because I'm upset, or it might be because I'm upset, but it's probably because I'm slightly losing my voice. Before we kick off, I want to offer... Oh, this is strange because I can't see my screen. I want to offer some, just a little bit of self-care. Some of the things that I talk about tonight might be things that you find distressing. I'm not going to go into any kind of graphic detail on anything. I'm not going to be describing situations that people have found traumatic or anything like that. Nonetheless, it might be things that you personally find distressing. At any point, please feel free to remove yourself from the room. If you need to step out, that's fine. I won't be offended. If actually what you need to do is just sit and listen, that's totally fine. There's no obligation to involve yourself in conversations. And if you do need to talk to somebody, as Mary said, there are people around after this session, or you may turn, to a trusted friend. It's surprising sometimes the things that strike us when we're not expecting it. So where are we going? I'm going to talk a little bit about what trauma is, get us all on the same page, and I'm going to talk about the way in which trauma impacts on the person and the body. And then I'm going to talk about some trauma theologies. There are quite a few, but I'm just going to tell you about my favorite ones, and I'll tell you about some of the others, and you can read more in your own time. And then in some shameless self-promotion, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own work and the forthcoming things I've written already and the forthcoming things I have coming out. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so. You're really welcome to put your hand up and ask me a question if you need to, but of course there'll be plenty of time for discussion at the end as well, and I'll be sticking around for a well-earned cup of tea, so I won't be shooting off there. And if I go back to the first slide, my email address is up there, although I'm very easy to find on the Westcott or Cambridge websites. If in 2 weeks' time you decide you've got a question for me, which is the speed of my own brain works, so that's totally fine as well. So I was just saying to Imogen that I've been working in this field for a decade, just over, and I fell into it by accident, having gone to university to do a PhD on Mary. I ended up doing a PhD on trauma. They are related, but that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. But suffice to say, I didn't know what it was. It was an emerging field, and it was something that nobody else really in the UK at the time was looking at very much. But it still surprises me that I've been doing this for a decade. In that time, lots of my own thinking has changed, and lots of the things we're going to look at tonight are things that are kind of in progress as well, because it's a field that's alive and moving a lot. So let's start by talking about what trauma actually is. Slippery and hard to define is how you should start with trying to pin this down. As I said, decade of working this, I don't have any neat definitions of trauma to give you, but I'm going to describe it a little bit and see if that helps us pin down something of what we're talking about here. So trauma is usually related to experiences that defy witnessing, cognition, conscious recall, and representation. They're things that are hard to grasp, things that are hard to remember, things that are hard to get hold of, things that are hard to listen to. It's often connected with power and powerlessness, so that people without power are much more vulnerable to a trauma experience that overwhelms their ordinary coping mechanisms or systems. We sometimes think of trauma as related to one big event that happens in somebody's life, and that may be the case, but it's often what we might call chronic or complex forms of trauma. So it's not one specific thing, but perhaps a decade of insidious, low-level micro-experiences that are producing the same effect in somebody. Trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, and wound is part of a language we find often in trauma studies: psychic wound, soul injury, moral injury. Again, there's some senses of being overwhelmed and helplessness important in there. So I've taken for you here, if you can see behind me, some definitions of trauma that start to try and pin down something of what we're talking about. Shelley Rambo, who's a trauma theologian, I'm going to introduce you to later. Sorry, I should just say, I'm really happy to send the slides to anybody, so if you do want them, just shout or get in touch with Imogen or Mary, and they can send them out to you if you want the slides. So Shelley Rambo, trauma theologian, we're going to look at her work later. She talks about trauma as the suffering that won't go away. There's an ongoingness connected here. The two medical definitions that I've got both talk about reactions to the experiencing of particular events, perhaps, and they both have a sense of ongoingness in them as well, something that doesn't finish. But it's hard to pin down. It's hard to encapsulate, and one of the things I try and do as someone who's a theologian and not a psychotherapist, psychologist, or psychiatrist, is I try and avoid, to some extent, using medical language for trauma, and lots of people that work in trauma theory and trauma theology in particular. You'll also find kind of trauma historians, trauma people who deal with English literature. You know what I mean? I wouldn't say trauma people who read books, but that's not right. You'll find, anyway, lots of people in the humanities and the arts working with trauma, but not in a medical context. So we're not using, or I certainly try not to use, medical definitions of trauma, which means it can be quite tricky to pin down what we're talking about. But the most important thing that I want you to take away from the start of this is that there is no such thing as a traumatic event. So there's no event that you can look at from the outside objectively and say, anyone who goes through that's going to have trauma. It doesn't work like that. Two people can go through exactly the same thing and only one of them come out experiencing trauma. So I prefer not to talk about trauma events, but rather trauma experiences. And the distinction there is really significant. Trauma is subjective. And as theologians then, that's really important, because when we're looking at something like the biblical text, we can't assume that just because an event looks horrific, that means it must have been traumatic. I use the example here of the crucifixion, and the question of, is Jesus a trauma survivor, is one we may want to pick up in discussion afterwards. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but we can't look at the crucifixion and say, oh yeah, because that's such a horrible, painful, gruesome event, therefore he must be. It just doesn't work like that. So I'll talk a little bit about what instead we might want to look for and how instead we might want to examine things like the biblical texts if we're not able to kind of pinpoint trauma on specific events. But I think it's really important, especially if you're interested in this from a pastoral sense, to recognize that people who've been through horrible things aren't necessarily traumatized, but also people can be traumatized by things you think aren't traumatic. Really low-level things, or things that you think, well, that wouldn't bother me at all. That's not how it works. There's no such thing as a traumatic event. There are only trauma experiences. Now, what I would normally do here, if I had longer, is then give you my lovely brief potted history, of trauma. Because I started talking about it in 2013. Of course, it existed long before then. And really, the history of contemporary trauma studies starts in the 1890s with the study of hysterical women in Paris. They were not hysterical, side note. If you're interested in that, I really recommend a book by Judith Herman called Trauma and Recovery, which is fantastic. Or there's an excellent book by Jonathan Shea called Odysseus in America, where he weaves the story of Vietnam veterans in with the Odyssey, demonstrating kind of trauma's always been part of the human nature. So two things there, so that you can catch up with where my history of trauma would have gone. But what do we know now? Primarily we know that trauma is something that sits in the body. So we often think of trauma, PTSD, those kinds of things, as kind of things that sit in this invisible, immaterial thing of the mind. That's not true. Trauma is a corporeal, embodied thing. It sits in the body and it has particular impacts that we don't see in other experiences that we might then call suffering. So suffering is a normal part of human life, and the main difference between suffering and trauma is that suffering tends not to produce these kinds of effects on the body. So trauma can cause impacts on memory, concentration, learning, one's ability to focus on things. It can mean that it's really hard for you to pinpoint what emotion that you're feeling is. It's really hard to calm yourself down, to self-soothe. It's hard to control emotional expression, either positively or negatively. And it can be really hard to distinguish what's safe and what's not safe. It can produce things like flashbacks, hallucinations, nightmares, very common in people who are experiencing trauma. And one of the most kind of recent developments that we're starting to recognize in trauma is that there is a biological component to it. So there's evidence that trauma can be passed, or trauma responses can be passed from body to body. So second and third generation of Holocaust survivors and of people who were slaves, second and third generation of their children can have in their bodies the same elevated responses, cortisol responses, genetic coding that their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents had, as it's passed on. It's not quite as simple as inherited through DNA. It's what's referred to as a biosocial cultural model, so that the combination of biology, your social life, and your culture all come together to pass on this experience of trauma in the genes. So lots of work being done on epigenetics at the moment, and revealing really interesting biological fixtures of trauma. So it's really important to note that this is something that takes place in the body and cannot be reasoned with. Bessel van der Kolk, whose book The Body Keeps the Score, is another one I would 100% suggest you add to your reading list. He is a psychotherapist who's worked with trauma survivors for decades. He says talking therapies will only take you so far. If you want somebody to be able to work on their recovery from trauma, you have to attend to the body. The body has to be retrained. Talking therapies, medicines, all good, but they won't be sufficient in themselves. So what are we recognizing then when we're talking about trauma? I use the language of rupture, and sometimes the image of the earthquake can be quite helpful in thinking about what trauma does to the person. So I talk about 3 ruptures, and this is my way of kind of talking about trauma but without using medical language to do that. So 3 ruptures. The first is of bodily integrity. The second is of language and cognition, so language and understanding go together. And the third is of time. And taken together, they start to indicate to us why the experience of trauma can be so devastating to the individual. So the first rupture, the one of bodily integrity, is probably the easiest one to grasp. This is very obvious in some of the ways in which bodies are violated, perhaps a bullet, perhaps through an assault of some kind, perhaps in damage caused by a natural disaster. The body is no longer a safe place in which to inhabit. It can't be trusted anymore. The second one, language and cognition, they go together. Language and understanding are related, how we make sense of the world. And these two go together because often what happens in the experience of trauma is that memory becomes inaccessible. So that rather than being able to remember something in a straight line, trauma survivors are perhaps more likely to remember in a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes putting the right selection of bits together, sometimes having gaps, missing pieces, sometimes having no pieces at all for particular bits. And it's one of the reasons why, particularly in terms of trying to prosecute rape, the rape survivor's story can be, if they experience trauma, inherently vulnerable and unpredictable, not because they're lying, but because of the very way in which trauma has impacted on their ability to reconstruct a story. It's one of the reasons why we have so few convictions for rape, not just in this country. And then the third rupture is that of time. And so things from the past, events from the past, keep trying to make themselves known in the present. They keep pushing in. So flashbacks, hallucinations, nightmares, keep trying to make themselves known in the present. So we've got these 3 kind of breakdowns happening if a person has experienced trauma. But what happens after trauma? I'm sorry you can't see the slides up there, but hopefully I'm explaining these clearly enough. I usually talk about not using language of healing or recovery. I don't use either of those words in my own work. I don't use them when I'm teaching, and largely because the trauma survivors that I've worked with don't use that language either. So I don't like to use recovery because it implies a kind of rewinding back to who you were, a kind of going backwards. That's just not possible. And I don't use healing from a theological point of view because I find that in a Christian context it kind of conjures up some perhaps unhelpful ideas about what actually is taking place here, and often the speed at which it might take place. Largely because the person who is trying to wrestle with their trauma may do so for a lifetime, and it may be something that they come back to over and over again over many years. So I prefer language of post-traumatic remaking, which I will admit is a mouthful, but is a better description of what the trauma survivor is doing after trauma. So this idea of post-traumatic remaking, putting oneself back together or putting oneself together in a new way, isn't linear. Now, because of the limitations of the English language, I have to put something at the beginning and something at the end, and that makes it look like it's a tick list that you kind of get through, tick, 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 done, recovered, healed. It doesn't work like that. And the English language lets me down. So I want you to think of this more like a very messy obstacle course that you may never find the way out of, but will keep going around the same obstacles again and again. That would be a bit more like it. The bedrock of which is that you have to be in a place of safety. You can't start remaking whilst you're still in the trauma. So if you can cast your mind back to COVID-19 and the first lockdown, one of the things that really irritated me was that there were a number of theologians, whose names I won't name, who managed to get books out in the first lockdown about what God was doing in the lockdown. I was like, we are not safe. Some of us are still not safe. So we can't start this process until we're in a place of safety. And one might need to re-find places of safety over and over again in one's lifetime. Trauma, this post-traumatic remaking then requires one to be able to tell one's story, perhaps over and over again, and have it witnessed and believed. And that process of being believed, of being heard and believed, is incredibly powerful. And the language of witnessing is one that we use quite readily within the church. And I'm always interested to think about what witnessing to trauma might look like for the church. Alongside that, then, is this requirement to pay attention to the body. As I said before, talking therapies are excellent, medicine's excellent, but there has to be this attention to the body. And that can happen in lots of different ways. One of the theologians I'm going to talk about in a moment is Serene Jones, and she talks about her own trauma and how she needed to find liturgies of the flesh, is how she described it. And interestingly, especially considering she was a church leader, she didn't find them in the church. She found them in acupuncture, massage, and breath work, which she did outside of the church as ways of reconnecting with her body. So paying attention to the body, and then lastly, well, not lastly, but because of that's how language works, lastly, becoming part of a community again, reconnecting with society. Trauma survivors are often isolated. They often isolate themselves. So finding ways, small ways or big ways, of reconnecting with society can be really helpful in this remaking activity. Okay, so that's the background. I'm just going to grab some water here. But let's talk about trauma theologies. So I've been working in trauma theology since 2013, but trauma theology has been around in a kind of embryonic form, at least, since just after 9/11. The connections, I hope, are obvious there. American theologians trying to wrestle with this collective experience that was completely new. We're trying then to think about, well, hang on a minute, what do we do with this theologically? And trying to think about, this in a pastoral sense, a doctrinal sense, an ethical sense, doing lots of different ways of approaching this work. So it's largely 21st century. It's largely female-dominated, which is unusual for any field of theology, but I like it. I will take it. It's quite small, so the odds are pretty good for us. And it's done in quite a few different ways. So I particularly kind of work with doctrines. Some people go out and interview people and then use that in a kind of practical theology way to think about what should the church do, what does that mean for what we believe. Some people are doing biblical stuff where they're reading the Bible and uncovering trauma that's kind of in the biblical text, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a moment. So there's lots of different ways, and because it's still quite a baby field in the 2,000 years of Christian theology, we've got about 20 years under our belt, new things are happening all the time. So it's quite hard to pin down what it is. But lots of people have asked me over the last decade, what, Karen, is the point of trauma theology? And I want to start there before I give you some examples of it. So what am I as a trauma theologian trying to do? Firstly, and always, I'm trying to take the body seriously in theology, recognizing that all theologies come out of bodies. Every single theology you've ever read has been produced in a body that has had particular experiences. Sometimes we're really good at naming those experiences, and sometimes we pretend this kind of theology emerged, kind of as if it kind of descended from heaven. So what I'm trying to do is paying attention to theology the theology that's done out of bodies, and often trauma theologians are people who've experienced trauma themselves, and they're writing out of their own experiences, producing it out of their own bodies. It's recognizing that theology isn't neutral. It does change. It isn't God-given, but rather human worked out, and therefore it picks up all of the bugs and the biases and the masks that humans have. One of the things I'm keen to do is highlight the ways in which theology often doesn't work in trauma-related contexts. I'm interested in challenging people and churches to create trauma-informed spaces and to think about what that might mean for communities. Aiming to resource people who are working with trauma. But one of the things I'm not aiming to do is explain why bad things happen to people, because it's a bit of a futile task. So I'm not aiming to do that. So let me introduce you then to 3 trauma theologians whom I love. If I stand kind of here, I need to be able to see the screen. Is that going to work? Okay. I'm going to side on for you. Yes. Perfect. Okay. Oh no, one or the other. There we go. Okay. Serene Jones. Serene Jones is how I discovered trauma theology. This book, Trauma and Grace, if you want to buy it, make sure you buy the 2nd edition because it's better. She did a lot of work. Excuse me. She did a lot of work in the between the 1st edition and the 2nd edition of making sure that what she was talking about was accurate and valid, and went back and revised it. So do buy the 2nd edition. Trauma for Jones is described as a devastating rupture to an individual's theological imagination. So she talks about this in terms of one's theological imagination. And she's a Calvinist, so she's doing some work with Calvin, and unsurprisingly, because she's a Calvinist, she's really interested in the cross. So she has a number of chapters in here about the mirrored cross and how when we look at the cross, we might see our own traumas reflected back to us, and that the crucifixion might therefore be a really helpful thing to work with in trauma survivors. She does use the language of healing, though, so yeah, I love her, but also, you know, I wouldn't use that. She's really interested in creative use of biblical texts, and she does a whole lot of work with the short ending of Mark's Gospel, where there's an empty tomb but no resurrection appearances, and it's all just a bit... And she likes the kind of ambiguity of that, the kind of senselessness of it, as a way of giving some space for trauma thinking to happen. But I've put a little quote in here just from the very first page. Oh, what a tease. And she talks about trauma as understanding the effects of violence upon the workings of our imagination and upon the bodies and souls of persons who have been traumatized. That's the central task of trauma theology. She says, too often we believe that when physical healing occurs, mental healing naturally follows, and that with time, all wounds heal. Such is not always the case, however. The balm-like work of theology and religion is to uncover and mend such wounds. And what medicine does this? Healing lies as much, if not more, in the stories we tell and the gestures we offer, as in the doctrines we preach. So you can see her interest in the theological imagination and this idea of the balm-like work of theology. If I had one critique of Serene Jones, it's that she's very optimistic about what theology can do. And I think she would take that critique. So she's approaching this very much out of biblical texts and a kind of creative imagination. So she's imagining herself into particular stories and reading them with a trauma perspective, with an aim of resourcing the church. So Serene Jones is how I encountered trauma theology. And this was one of the first books really to think through trauma at all in a theological perspective. Don't buy this one. Although it's excellent, It's really hard to read, and I say that as someone who's been trying to read it for a decade. It's her PhD thesis, and it's pretty impenetrable. Shelley Rambo, then, she's written this book, and then she has a second book called Resurrected Wounds, which is much easier to read. So if you do want one of hers, go for that one. She's working out of her experience of Hurricane Katrina. So in 2008 or 9, she visited and spent some time in New Orleans with the pastors who were working in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And her approach is through the motif of Holy Saturday. So if I were to ask you to remember one theological idea from tonight, it would be that the theological idea of Holy Saturday has been one of the most powerful ideas in trauma theology at all, completely. What Rambo wants to do is resist rushing too fast to the resurrection. She says that we want to go from the bleakness of Good Friday to the triumph of Easter Sunday without paying attention to the death and destruction and devastation and loss and hopelessness that sits in the middle, Holy Saturday. And what she's trying to do there is both a liturgical thing, so there's an encouragement to pay liturgical attention to Holy Saturday. I don't know if you do that in this church, but I do know that Mary has written some fantastic resources for doing that, along with some of her colleagues. But also in how we preach. We don't expect the resurrection, the victory, the triumph to come immediately. Or we shouldn't impose that on people. That actually we might need to give people space to sit in Holy Saturday as the disciples did, where there was only death and not yet hope because they did not know what was coming. They didn't know about Easter Sunday yet. They only knew that Jesus had died and that it was hopeless. Everything they had worked for had gone. She claims that as a very powerful theological idea, particularly when ministering to people, and particularly in thinking about what impact trauma has. It just upends everything that you've known. And she uses the kind of language of the disciples to talk about what it might mean to be someone who's experiencing trauma. She has a quote here, but I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to read it out to you. The third one then, I've put the picture of Erica up here, mainly because her book cover is so boring. It's one of those series of books where they do the same cover for every single book with just a different title. So I thought you'd like to see Erica's face instead. Erica Dunbar, she does an incredible reading of the book of Esther. It's called Trafficking Hadassah, Collective Trauma, Cultural Memory and Identity in the Book of Esther and the African Diaspora. So this is different to the first two. She's not looking at pastoral theology. She's not looking at doctrine. She's not looking at preaching. She is doing a biblical trauma approach here. And she's reading the book of Esther as a narrative of sexual trafficking and exploitation. So she takes particularly the first 2 chapters of the book of Esther and reads that alongside the sexual trafficking of African girls and women from Africa to the Americas, and then the continued exploitation of black girls and women in the Americas, kind of as legacies of slaves. So I'll read the quote to you because it captures what she's talking about here. She says, the first 2 chapters of the book of Esther capture and epitomize the cultural memories and histories of Afrikaner girls and women across time, space, place, nations, oceans, and continents. Esther chapter 2, especially, has strong resonances with the materialized pain, primping, and pimping of forcibly diasporized Afrikaner female bodies of the slave trade. When read alongside these experiences of Afrikaner girls and women, the words in the story of Esther are made flesh and dwell among us, teaching us how colonization and sexualized traumatization marks the bodies, identities, memories, and histories of African diasporic people in very specific ways. So it's an example. I'm going to give this. It's an example of a different way of doing trauma theology. She's particularly interested in reading the biblical text as, and she reads that alongside slave narratives in a very uncomfortable reading. And I heard her speak at a conference a few years ago, and it was eye-opening to me because I had only ever heard the story of Esther told as this kind of princess narrative, one night with the king, you know, a kind of, oh, and she becomes the queen and then she gets to save everybody. I'd never noticed the sexual trafficking, the trauma that was underlying this text. And that's just one example of a whole range of scholars attending mostly to the Old Testament, not so much to the New Testament. I don't know why. And it is a problem because we're starting to make some assumptions about what's going on in the New Testament that aren't really supported. But she is uncovering something that is in the text. And she's, as I say, part of a group of scholars who are doing that kind of work, particularly with the Hebrew Bible. So, what am I doing? I started by thinking about the Eucharist. I'm a liturgist, so I'm really interested in the Eucharist, and my PhD work was looking at the Eucharist as both a place of trauma, bodies broken open, but also perhaps a place of remaking as well. Interestingly, I am not the only trauma theologian who's fascinated with the Eucharist. Almost every trauma theologian that ends up dealing with theology rather than biblical text ends up talking about the Eucharist in some way. It's almost inescapable. So that was my first work, and then I have a couple of edited collections which are fantastic. We have some of the contributors to that in the room here. And then my last book was on reproductive loss. So I experienced a number of miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies when I was in my 20s. I've written quite openly about it. And I experienced that as a trauma experience. And it took me a long time to start the remaking. So what I'm doing in that book is actually allowing this trauma experience to disrupt, uproot, kind of play around with, but that's a bit too of a gentler word, with theology. So I look particularly at the doctrine of providence. What does it mean for the trauma survivor to believe that God has a very clear plan for their life? And how do we deal with the doctrine of providence from a trauma perspective? I also looked at the practice of intercessory prayer, because I had been in a charismatic congregation that prayed very fervently for me to not lose babies, and then I had. What does that mean then for how we think about intercessory prayer? And because I felt lost, there were no liturgies, there were no prayers available for me, I had nothing, I wrote some. So the last part of the book is a series of prayers and liturgies that are written out of my experience, out of that rethinking through theology, because what I felt was there was quite a lot of bad theology knocking around. The other doctrine that I looked at was hope, and the ways in which I had been encouraged to hope and what it might mean to have a hope in Jesus. And my kind of conclusion was that doesn't mean I'm not going to lose pregnancies. But the way that that's often deployed within the kind of churches that I was in had a different kind of meaning that was really unhelpful. So it's called Reconceiving Theology Through Reproductive Loss. It's a rethinking, a reimagining of theology, and that's very much how I do my theological work. So I've got some examples of prayers up there, which I'm really happy to go through in Q&A if anyone wants to look at those. But I want to finish by saying that after 10 years of working in this field and giving talks like this and having people say, great, what do we do? My last work, my most recent work, which is out later this year, is an attempt to try and answer that question. What then should we do? So the book that I've written is called Survival: Radical Spiritual Practices for Trauma Survivors. And each chapter takes a different practice, like a practice of being angry, or a practice of not forgiving people, and offers them as something that might temporarily be a good thing for the trauma survivor in terms of their relationship with God. So it's a little bit topsy-turvy in that we're kind of disrupting some of the things that we sometimes think are really good, in order to offer practices, spiritual practices, embodied practices that might actually be useful for the trauma survivor. So it's a field in progress. It's quite vast. I've given you a tiny taste of it this evening, but it's something that I think is really important. I'm vastly committed to the idea that we need to be trauma-informed churches, that many of our churches will have traumatized people within them, and that it is part of our responsibility to care for them and working out ways of doing that effectively is the thing that I am very passionate about, things that I'm teaching my students like Mary, and things that I'm writing about as well. So, thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
We just need a minute to reorder some things because Karen is going to sit down.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. So now we have time for questions. So yeah, if you would like to ask some questions. Okay, so we'll start here.
Thank you, Karen. Would you say that grief counts as trauma for some people?
It certainly can do. I mean, again, I'm always of the opinion, because of the way I approach trauma, that I'm not able to gatekeep what trauma is, and people experience things in different ways. And so I would certainly say that there's a possibility that somebody might experience and then have that kind of embodied experiences going on. And in fact, although I tend to avoid the medical definitions, the formal definition of PTSD does include perhaps the sudden death of a loved one or witnessing of a death, and even in a kind of secondary traumatization way where, which is particularly particularly equated to the news and social media and kind of absorbing kind of continuous, if you think particularly about the kind of coverage of Gaza, the kinds of things that people are witnessing on social media, again, even though they're not people you know or love, can produce what's called vicarious trauma within the body. And so I'm always of the opinion that if somebody's experiencing those kinds of things from whatever the event is, then, let's call a spade and help people with it. So yeah, does that help? Yeah.
What do you say to sort of scriptures where you've got St. Paul, when you talk about reconnecting with the body, you've got the likes of St. Paul saying the opposite, saying that we need to separate ourselves because our body is sinful?
I say... So the overall picture that the Bible offers of a person's relationship between body and soul is of unity and wholeness, and that more of a kind of embodied soul or an ensouled body, so that the soul and the body are part of the same thing and can't be separated out from each other. So I know what Paul says. I think there are generous readings of it that might put it more in that kind of monist, kind of, body and soul are one and can't be separated out from each other. And I would largely prefer to take that over Paul. Primarily as well because of the way in which that's then been used over the centuries. So think about into the Desert Fathers and Mothers, into medieval spirituality, where there is often a kind of distaste for the body, particularly women's bodies, particularly bodies that don't fit into the kind of perfect classic male body of the priest or the monk. Anything that's not that is lesser and is deformed, and therefore is treated as less and less and less. So, Augustine says that a woman is only her full self when she comes to Christ under her husband. Well, I think a perfect example of theologies being created out of one's bodies and not necessarily kind of descending God-given from there. So pinch of salt is, I guess, how I would take it, with a reflection on the kind of overall understanding of what the Bible pictures as what it means to be human, and a recognition. There's been some really interesting work. I'm not sure how convinced I am by it, but some interesting work on some of Paul's letters where they depict Paul as a trauma survivor. So 2 Corinthians particularly has been read as a letter that has within it trauma. I don't know if that's true. I think more work needs to be done. It's interesting to me that biblical scholars working in trauma don't work in the New Testament, by and large. They mostly want to focus on the Old Testament. And I think some of that is discomfort around Jesus and what we might say about Jesus and Jesus's body if we start getting into that kind of thing. So generally, I'm not a fan of Paul, and as much as I try to avoid him, that's how I approach him. Yeah. Fortunately, I'm not a biblical studies teacher, so, it doesn't matter so much.
Didn't he have something wrong with him anyway? Isn't he complaining about his
there's
body
some kind of, he certainly has some kind of illness or injury. He also complains about his eyesight going. He's shipwrecked. There are lots of things, although we can't, and I wouldn't encourage us to try and say, oh, he went through this, therefore he's a trauma survivor. There's certainly plenty of stuff in there that other people have experienced as traumatic. So, more work needs to be done, but people are starting to think through what that might mean for Paul as a narrator to be writing out of a trauma context. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have 2 quite separate questions. The first is, are you aware of moves towards trauma theology in other religions? And the second is, what are trauma theologians saying about trauma caused by the church?
The only religion that I'm familiar with that I know is doing work in this is Judaism, and they have been for a long time. Certainly post the Shoah, post World War II. And actually much of what we use now as trauma theory is developed out of Jewish scholars who were concentration camp survivors themselves, who then came to the US. There's a famous guy called Dory Laub, who was a Jew, a concentration camp survivor, came to the US, trained as a psychiatrist, and actually we owe much of our kind of foundations of trauma theory to the work that he did. So yes, very much so there. I'm not very familiar with Islamic theology, so I'm not really able to comment there, but certainly in Judaism it's happening. What are trauma survivors saying about church and the church as a place of trauma? Trauma theologians. Well, they're saying things like, if the church has been a place of trauma for you, don't go back to it, and that actually you may need to form faith communities that are separate to the church as places of safety in which that post-traumatic remaking can happen. They're saying that the church itself needs to take if it wants to be trauma-informed, as it often says it wants to be, and trauma-sensitive, then it needs to deal with the fact that it is also a trauma perpetrator. That's the Church of England, as well as many other kinds of churches. And interesting, so one of the things I've been thinking about as a trauma theologian is the capacity of different types of Christian churches to be trauma engaged. It requires a willingness to take hard looks at theology and to take hard looks at the Bible. And if you're part of a church that is not willing to do those kinds of things because of how it understands its theology and how it understands the biblical text, then I have a big question about the extent to which it is able then to be trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive, because I don't think it is. If you can't go through some of that deconstructive work where you're willing to ask questions and allow trauma to play out in ways that are quite unpredictable in your theology, and perhaps say, we can't believe that anymore, then, yeah, you're not going to be able to do that kind of work. And it's quite I think we're only just starting to realise what's required of a collective community in that, and it's quite challenging. Yeah.
It was a very similar question. I was just going to ask, I was surprised that there wasn't more Christian theology on trauma because of the Jewish theology done post-Shoah, and that hasn't impacted earlier on Christian theology?
So there is some impact, but it doesn't tend to be naming trauma, so it tends to be talking about suffering or theodicies, where we try and explain why bad things have happened to people. So it is there. It's not like Christians have never been interested in suffering before, but the actual understanding of trauma is something distinct from suffering and very much not the same thing, is only really post 9/11. Yeah. Takes a lot, right, for people to get interested in it. Andy.
Karen, lovely talk, thank you. I also was going to ask about Judaism, but you've answered that.
Okay.
But can I ask about something different?
Yeah.
About breathwork. You mentioned that. Could you say a little bit about how, I don't know, as Christians we can relate to breathwork?
Yeah, I can. So breathwork is really useful because it's a very simple embodied practice that doesn't require you to kind of like lie down or have any special equipment or do anything. You could do it right now and nobody would even know that you were doing it. So it's fantastic for kind of on the spot dealing with perhaps if you're feeling quite triggered or threatened or anxious. And quite a lot of liturgists are writing liturgies that include breath work as a form of prayer. So if I can show you. These are two prayers that are from my work in around pregnancy loss, and I absolutely hold my hands up and say I'm completely inspired by a woman called the Black Liturgy. She does lots of breath prayers. It's very much part of her practice. So when I'm talking about the need to pay attention to the body and return to the body and focus in on the body, using one's breath is a really simple way of doing that. So with these, it's essentially a collect with an inhale and an exhale. So if you look at the one on the right, on the inhale after the collect, you say, God, I do not know the answers. And then on the exhale, but keep me in your ways. And so you might use that with a cantor at the front and you just following with the breath pattern, or you might use it in a small group where you might use the inhale, exhale repeatedly for a few minutes until one's done. Actually, we've used it in the Westcott Chapel as forms of intercessions. Students have written their own, and they're quite powerful ways of doing it. The best way of doing breath work is with the Jesus prayer, which is Jesus Christ, Son of God, on the inhale, have mercy on me, a sinner, if you want to add that in as well, on the exhale. And that's my kind of standard go-to practice in church when things are quiet and I'm waiting for stuff to happen, is that inhale and exhale. I find it a really powerful way of connecting with my body, of being present in a space. So the Black Liturgist, she's on Instagram, but her book is called Black Liturgies, and it is absolutely phenomenal if you're looking for something for your own spiritual life, for resourcing other people. 100% can't recommend it highly enough. It's really, really good. Yeah.
I'd just like to make a general comment. I work with quite a lot of young people and young adults, and some of them have been ritualistically abused and also been in cults. So I'm just making a general point that as a church, it's so important for us to put a positive message out there that we're a healing, whole, godly community, and that we really do make it quite plain, separate from the unhealthy religion that's going around. That's
yeah,
I mean, to say.
I think my only response to that would be to say, don't assume that churches are going to be good places ever for trauma survivors. They might not, and that's not anything about you. That's about what they need in order to have as places of safety. And it may be that not coming to church is absolutely what they need for their spiritual lives at that point. They may come back a long time later, but yes, I'm so glad that that's how you feel about your church, and that should be the message that you put out about your church. But also, churches are not always good places for people that have been people that have experienced trauma. Sorry, go on.
I was just wondering, like, one of the fundamental things that one believes across, a lot of theologies and different types of Christianity denominations is that God is essentially and fundamentally good, and trauma shatters that belief that God is good and the world is a safe place. So how does that, how can you reconcile? I mean, how can one still remain in God, with God, or whatever that means, and reconcile that somehow with the life experience or the reality that happened?
Yeah. Save the tough question for the end. That's the fundamental question, I think, that's really significant here, is that actually what is needed is, or what the kind of work I have been doing is particularly around this idea of providence, this idea that God has a blueprint for one's life and control of every step within that. Because if that's our belief, then yes, when trauma happens, how can you possibly believe that God is good? I don't know. And for me, that has required a massive undoing of the kind of doctrine of providence that I had been taught in a very charismatic evangelical church as a young person. And actually what I needed to do was, or where I found help for that, was in feminist reimaginings of power, and this idea of a softer form of power that wasn't a king on the throne directing every kind of movement, but rather a sister, a mother who walked beside me, who gently nudges other people to have positive involvement in my life, but isn't this kind of Lord. And so a lot of it was undoing a lot of the language that I used about God as well. And so for some people that's, well, it's a form of deconstructing our theology. And if you, you have to be able to do that in order to reconcile trauma experiences and faith. And I think that's really hard. But ultimately, that's what all trauma theology is trying to do. It's never trying to move people away from the church or away from faith, but always trying to work out how, therefore, can we still believe in God and worship God and trust God. So yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. It's a really good question. Oh, we're sneaking in one more. Go for it. Okay.
So two things. One very quick point. Just a word of caution on breath work. So I know a lot of people who love it. Stop and think about telling someone when they have your permission to breathe and not breathe, and think about what reactions that may stir up. So, I would say all of these embodied practices, some work really well for some people and some are just absolutely disastrous. Yeah. So tread with caution, I guess would be my observation there. So I did the thing you recommended not to do. I just finished the Shelley Rambo, Spirit and Trauma.
How did you find it?
Great. So really
good.
Liked
Dense,
it,
though.
but hard. Yeah. And the bit that I kind of wasn't expecting to see that came through very strongly was the stuff about sort of John 14, about the Spirit as friend, counselor, teacher, long-term companion, reweaving your life. I found that stuff excellent. And then hearing you talk about charismatic church experiences of when did we allow the Spirit to become co-opted as a dramatic instant fix that was loud and in your face and optimistic? Could you just sort of expand a little bit about, there's the Spirit I read about in the Bible,
the drama.
and the Spirit I hear about in church.
Right, yeah.
Why are those two different, and how do we unpick it?
Were you in church this morning? Because you get Acts 2 and you get the drama of the Holy Spirit, and you get it alongside John's Gospel where there's no drama of the Holy Spirit. But my preference is to use she for the Holy Spirit, so that's what I'm going to do. She is one that accompanies us. She's one that convicts us. She's one that transforms us, forms us into Christ-like beings through prayer, through incorporation. When did we like the drama and the charismatic, apologies to anyone who's part of charismatic churches here, but certainly from the American context, there has been a co-opting of this idea that Pentecost is the way in which we encounter the Spirit. That's the extraordinary. And actually, I preached this week at Thursday night, and if you go on my website, you can find my sermon if you're so inclined. actually, we find the Spirit in the transformation of the ordinary, and Pentecost is the exception, not the rule. So I'm 100% with Shelley Rambo that, yes, you may encounter the Spirit in these big, breathtaking moments, but you're much more likely to encounter her as someone who is an accompanier through our entire lives, and in very small and basic ways. And that's part of that feminist reimagining of providence that I was talking about, that kind of power. It's not the drama, but it's the ongoing gentleness of something that continues to shape and remold us. And I know in a couple of weeks you've got Hannah Fitch talking about feminist theology, so she's going to pick up more of that as well, which is fantastic. So thank you so much for your questions. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And Karen is staying for refreshments, so if you have more questions for her, I'm sure she will be happy to answer.
Thank you. Thanks.